Good morning, everyone. Welcome here today. My name is Collin, and I've been invited here today to talk to you about the story of my relatives, and as well about my experience of learning about the Holocaust. Well, to start, as you already mentioned, I'm the great-grandson of Israel Brandwine and Zipporah Frankel, both of whom are Holocaust survivors. They're not with us anymore today, but they were here for the greater part of my life, into my early teenage years. My brother, my other cousins, the other grandchildren, and I were taught at a young age the importance of learning about the Holocaust, as well as the importance of passing down that information to every generation. In fact, every generation in my family always made that a really big importance, so that we understand one day for our kids what the importance is of passing it down once again. Having two Holocaust survivors in my family did a lot of things for me. It gave me perspective and context to what I was learning. For example, in school or through movies and books, whatever I would learn about the war, it gave me a context, personalities that I could associate to it, and people that I interacted with every day, that I can see what their relationship was to something so serious. But it was more than just that. I can honestly say that the story of my great-grandparents affected my outlook on life. Their story. Israel was born in September, while Zipporah was born in November, both of 1921. They were born in the towns of Radomer and Radomer, respectively, both small towns in Poland. Their story is a long one, but for concise purposes, as they got into their early 20s, tensions in Europe started to grow at that time with the rise of Nazi Germany, and they were both placed in ghettos in their respective villages and moved to different ghettos. Over the years, their conditions of living became worse and worse, and their amenities that they had at their availability became worse and worse as time went on. Eventually, Zipporah was incarcerated in Auschwitz for 3.5 years, while Israel was in several concentration camps, namely Sachsenhausen and Pionki in Poland. They both lost most of their families during the war. Israel lost 3 brothers, a sister, and both of his parents, while Zipporah lost 1 brother, 3 sisters, and her mother. They met in Germany after being liberated from their respective concentration camps. They married in Stuttgart, Germany in January of 1946 and gave birth to their daughter Ida in January of 1947. They clearly didn't want to stay in Europe anymore after the time, so they decided to start a new life and immigrate to Canada in January of 1948 with nothing more than $3.25 in Israel's pocket. Ida at the time was sick. Their idea was to go to Winnipeg, but they had to stop in Montreal in order to deal with Ida and make any money that they could at the time to support the family. The only experience Israel had was working as a tailor for his father for several years in Poland. So immediately as he got to Montreal, he began work as a tailor. 3 generations now, we're still here. Zipporah wrote about her experiences in memoirs, as did Israel as well. I had the privilege of reading some of these while I was studying particular topics in school, and they gave me a more deep understanding of what I wanted to talk about here today. But that was still difficult for me when asked to talk about my feelings about the Holocaust. I'm a 4th generation descendant, either from the direct survivors or even from their parents. I never experienced any of this firsthand. In fact, I couldn't even begin to imagine what it was that they went through, let alone sympathize for something like that. And so it was hard for me to relate to something like that when I wanted to talk about my feelings. But the truth is, I do have feelings on the subject, and it's important that people recognize this so that they're able to pass these down. One of the first things that I think about, and is what I mentioned before, is it gave me an alternate approach to what I would learn just on a factual basis. So what I would learn from school and books and movies and things of that nature, it gave me personalities that I could connect with. People in my family that I saw all the time. It made it a more difficult emotional experience to have, but it made it all the more worthwhile to learn about these things. That's how I always felt. I had the privilege of going to several different Holocaust museums and memorials in Montreal, New York, and Yad Vashem in Israel. These were particularly difficult, as I mentioned, times for me to learn about, but I'm very grateful for these opportunities also, because it allowed me to imagine loved ones in my family, what they went through. It associated something more deep for me, and absolutely something more meaningful. A particular story that I want to talk about is for my great-grandmother. They called her Bubby. She had a tattoo on her arm, That's how I referred to it when I was too young to understand it. Later I realized that when she was incarcerated in Auschwitz, as many of you know, prisoners were given a tattoo to number them, to identify them. And when I was younger, I would ask her why she had that on her arm and why she wouldn't remove it after all these years. And she would always tell me to remember, because lest we forget. When I went to Yad Vashem in Israel last year, I saw a particularly striking memorial of the arm of hundreds of different prisoners from Auschwitz lined up in the gallery. And that made me reflect on the life of my great-grandmother. And only in that moment did I really understand why she had decided to keep that. Not as a burden to herself, but to serve the memory that even though she's created this new beautiful life for herself, to never forget what she had been through in the first place. And more so, to remember that she was more than just a number, more than just a statistic. She had a life, and a beautiful life to live. As I mentioned, I'm the 4th generation Holocaust survivor. And as every generation goes by, it becomes more and more of a challenge to pass on the information. We're lucky enough to have some Holocaust survivors with us today, but as we know, there are less and less of those every single year. There's less concrete stories and examples and traditions to draw on when there's not as many people alive from that experience anymore. And I think that's the challenge of my generation. How can you make this something relatable and something understandable for my children and their children to come after that? I believe that the most important key in ensuring that something like this will never happen again in our world is to ensure that we have proper understanding, proper education of what these things happen, and proper moral values to know where we went wrong, to understand when the signs of bigotry and hatred start to push over love and compassion. We need to recognize when these things happen in our world, because that's when we need to act. And so if we can pass these messages on to our children who understand what have happened, then I think that's our best chance at ensuring like something like this won't happen again in our society. And it's gatherings like this that are exactly the right way about doing it. I inherited a responsibility from my great-grandparents, but let me be honest that it was not a burden. My responsibility that I inherited was to pass down the information, but while I inherited that, I also was given a story to tell, and that's something that I cherish. One of the last things that I think about when I reflect on my thoughts of the Holocaust are the life that my great-grandparents lived. Now I know this isn't a eulogy for them, but automatically I think about their life, what they lived through, and what they were able to live after the war. And I think of my great-grandfather. I used to call him Jaida. I was always impressed by his outlook on life, by his positive, cheerful, smiling attitude, always bearing gifts whenever I saw him. And I was always so perplexed at how a man who had been through so much was able to keep such a positive outlook on life. After he had had everything taken away from him, how was he still able to give so much? And I think that really exemplifies the spirit of a survivor. Maybe it was a testament to his personality. Maybe that's just who he was as a man. But I'd like to think that the spirit of the survivor lives on through him just by the man that he was. Speaking of the spirit of the survivor, I'd like to end today on the work of another. Israel gave my grandmother Ida a poem for her to read many years ago, and she kept it all this time, and today she's passed it down to us. Some of you may have read this poem before. I believe it does a great job of summarizing my feelings on the subject, but from a different perspective. As well, it talks about the spirit of the survivor that I just mentioned. I'd like to go ahead and read that poem for you today. It's called A Survivor. The author is unknown. A survivor is a restless, tortured person. The only thing she can really enjoy are her children. Yet a survivor's child is not easy to be, for she expects from her child the impossible. A survivor wants her child to be constantly happy, to do all the things she couldn't do, to learn everything she was denied. In her eagerness, she places a burden on the child, for the child must develop her own image, experience and learn from her own mistakes. The child must be allowed to experience even pain so that she can recognize happiness when it comes her way. A survivor will take in a sweat from her nightmares, unable to sleep again, in vain, does she chase the ghosts from her bedside, but they remain her guests for the rest of the night. A survivor possesses one thing you do not: a fearlessness of death. For she has faced death so many times, and also because she knows that this is when she will finally find peace. I expose myself to you and remove the mask of the survivor, so you can become aware of the full impact of the Holocaust. To understand that when they killed the 6 million, you may as well know what happened to the living. This you cannot study in your textbook. Our pain is not on record. It's important for you to know, since you are at the threshold of your life. Some of you may become future leaders. It will be up to you to fight oppression and bigotry. To insist on laws where everybody is free to worship, to lead productive lives, to educate their children. If you will remember the Holocaust, you will prevent history from repeating itself. You must never again stand by silently when such injustice breaks out against the people. Thank you very much.
Yeah.